Segment 1, Introduction to the ID, Ego, and Superego. The ID, Ego, and Superego are three distinct, interacting agents in the psychic apparatus, defined in Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche. The three agents are theoretical constructs that Freud employed to describe the basic structure of mental life as it was encountered in psychoanalytic practice. Freud himself used the German terms das Ich and Über-Ich, which literally translate as the it, I, and over I. The Latin terms ID, ego, and superego were chosen by his original translators and have remained in use. The ID is the primitive, impulsive part of the personality that is driven by instincts and desires. It is the source of all psychic energy and is responsible for our basic needs and wants, such as hunger, thirst, and sex. The ID is also responsible for our aggressive and destructive impulses. The ego is the rational, conscious part of the personality that mediates between the demands of the ID and the realities of the external world. The ego strives to balance the ID's desires with the superego's moral guidance, striving to maintain harmony within the human psyche. The superego is the moralistic part of the personality that internalizes the values and standards of society. It acts as a conscience, judging our thoughts and actions and making us feel guilty when we violate its moral code. The ID, ego, and superego are all present in all of us, but their relative strength and influence can vary from person to person. A healthy personality is one in which the ID, ego, and superego are in balance, but this is not always the case. An imbalance between these three forces can lead to a variety of psychological problems. For example, a person with an overly dominant ID may be impulsive and reckless, while a person with an overly dominant superego may be overly moralistic and judgmental. The ego plays a crucial role in maintaining balance between the ID and superego, and it is important to develop a strong ego in order to live a healthy and fulfilling life. The development of the ID, ego, and superego. Freud believed that the ID is present from birth, but the ego and superego develop over time. The ego begins to develop in early infancy as the child learns to distinguish between itself and the external world. The superego begins to develop around the age of 3 as the child internalizes the values and standards of its parents and other caregivers. The development of the ID, ego, and superego is a complex process that is influenced by a variety of factors, including the child's temperament, parenting style, and cultural background. The dynamic relationship between the ID, ego, and superego. The ID, ego, and superego are in a constant state of conflict. The ID is constantly demanding immediate gratification, while the superego is constantly trying to suppress the ID's impulses. The ego must mediate between these two forces, trying to find a balance that satisfies both the ID and the superego. This conflict between the ID, ego, and superego is the driving force behind human behavior. It is what motivates us to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and it is what helps us to develop a sense of morality and conscience. In the next section, we will take a closer look at the ID, its characteristics, and its role in personality. Segment 2, the ID. The ID is the primitive, impulsive part of the personality that is driven by instincts and desires. It is the source of all psychic energy and is responsible for our basic needs and wants, such as hunger, thirst, and sex. The ID is also responsible for our aggressive and destructive impulses. The ID is the only part of the personality that is present from birth. It is completely unconscious and operates on the pleasure principle, which seeks immediate gratification of all needs and desires. The ID does not care about reality or consequences. It only wants what it wants, and it wants it now. The ID is essential for survival. It drives us to eat when we are hungry, to drink when we are thirsty, and to have sex when we are aroused. The ID also drives us to protect ourselves and our loved ones from danger. However, the ID can also be destructive. The ID is responsible for our aggressive and destructive impulses, such as anger, hatred, and violence. If the ID is not controlled by the ego and superego, it can lead to serious problems, such as crime, addiction, and self-harm. Here are some examples of the ID in action. A baby crying for food or attention. A toddler screaming because she can't have the toy she wants. A teenager stealing money from his parents to buy drugs. An adult having an angry outburst at work. A person who is addicted to gambling or sex. It is important to note that the ID is not a bad thing. It is simply a part of our nature. However, it is important to control the ID and to use its energy in a constructive way. The ego and superego play a crucial role in this process. The ego helps to control the ID by mediating between its demands and the realities of the external world. The superego helps to control the ID by instilling a moral code and making us feel guilty when we violate it. A healthy personality is one in which the ID, ego, and superego are in balance. The ID should not be so strong that it controls our behavior, but it should also not be so weak that it cannot motivate us to meet our basic needs. The ego and superego should be strong enough to control the ID and to guide us towards a moral and fulfilling life. Segment 3. The ego. The ego is the rational, conscious part of the personality that mediates between the demands of the ID and the realities of the external world. The ego strives to balance the ID's desires with the superego's moral guidance, striving to maintain harmony within the human psyche. The ego is responsible for a variety of functions, including perception. The ego perceives the external world and our internal thoughts and feelings. Reality testing. The ego assesses the reality of the ID's desires and the superego's moral code. Decision making. The ego weighs the pros and cons of different options and makes decisions about how to act. Planning. The ego makes plans for the future and sets goals for ourselves. Problem solving. The ego solves problems and overcomes obstacles. Defense mechanisms. The ego uses defense mechanisms to protect us from anxiety and guilt. The ego is essential for our survival and well-being. It helps us to function in the world and to live happy and fulfilling lives. Here are some examples of the ego in action. A student deciding how to study for a test. A worker negotiating a raise with her boss. A parent disciplining their child. A person deciding whether or not to cheat on their partner. A person coping with the death of a loved one. The ego is constantly at work, even when we are not aware of it. It is constantly monitoring our thoughts and feelings, and it is constantly making decisions about how to act. A healthy ego is strong enough to control the ID and to guide us towards a moral and fulfilling life. However, an ego that is too weak or too strong can lead to problems. For example, a person with a weak ego may be impulsive and reckless, while a person with a strong ego may be overly arrogant and self-centered. It is important to develop a strong ego in order to live a healthy and fulfilling life. The ego is the part of our personality that helps us to function in the world and to achieve our goals. Here are some tips for developing a strong ego. Be aware of your thoughts and feelings. The first step to developing a strong ego is to be aware of your thoughts and feelings. This includes identifying your emotions, understanding your motivations, and recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. Set realistic goals. Once you are aware of your thoughts and feelings, you can start to set realistic goals for yourself. Your goals should be challenging but achievable. Take action. Once you have set goals for yourself, you need to take action to achieve them. This means developing a plan, breaking down your goals into smaller steps, and taking action on a regular basis. Be patient. Developing a strong ego takes time and effort. Don't get discouraged if you don't see results immediately. Just keep working at it and you will eventually reach your goals. Segment 4. The superego. The superego is the moralistic part of the personality that internalizes the values and standards of society. It acts as a conscience, judging our thoughts and actions and making us feel guilty when we violate its moral code. The superego begins to develop around the age of 3 as the child internalizes the values and standards of its parents and other caregivers. The superego is responsible for our sense of right and wrong, and it helps us to develop a moral conscience. The superego is divided into two parts, the ego ideal and the conscience. The ego ideal is the idealized image of ourselves that we strive to achieve. It represents our goals and aspirations. The conscience is the part of the superego that judges our thoughts and actions and makes us feel guilty when we violate its moral code. The superego is essential for developing a moral conscience and for living a socially acceptable life. However, the superego can also be destructive. If the superego is too harsh or too judgmental, it can lead to feelings of guilt, anxiety, and shame. It can also lead to perfectionism and self-criticism. Here are some examples of the superego in action. A person feeling guilty for stealing something from a store. A person feeling anxious about giving a presentation at work. A person feeling ashamed for having an affair. A person striving to be the best student in their class. A person being a role model for others. A healthy superego is one that is strong enough to guide us towards a moral and fulfilling life, but not so strong that it paralyzes us with guilt and anxiety. Here are some tips for developing a healthy superego. Learn about your values and beliefs. The first step to developing a healthy superego is to learn about your values and beliefs. What is important to you? What do you believe in? Once you are aware of your values and beliefs, you can start to live in accordance with them. Be forgiving of yourself. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is to learn from our mistakes and to try to do better next time. Don't beat yourself up over your mistakes. Forgive yourself and move on. Seek help from a therapist. If you are struggling with guilt, anxiety, or shame, it may be helpful to seek help from a therapist. A therapist can help you to understand your superego and to develop healthy coping mechanisms. The superego is an important part of our personality. It helps us to develop a moral conscience and to live a socially acceptable life. However, it is important to develop a healthy superego that does not paralyze us with guilt and anxiety. Segment 5, Conclusion. The ID, ego, and superego are three distinct, interacting agents in the psychic apparatus, defined in Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche. The three agents are theoretical constructs that Freud employed to describe the basic structure of mental life as it was encountered in psychoanalytic practice. The ID is the primitive, impulsive part of the personality that is driven by instincts and desires. The ego is the rational, conscious part of the personality that mediates between the demands of the ID and the realities of the external world. The superego is the moralistic part of the personality that internalizes the values and standards of society. The ID, ego, and superego are all present in all of us, but their relative strength and influence can vary from person to person. A healthy personality is one in which the ID, ego, and superego are in balance. The ID, ego, and superego play a crucial role in our behavior. They motivate us to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and they help us to develop a sense of morality and conscience. Freud's theory of the ID, ego, and superego has been influential in the field of psychology for over a century. It has helped us to understand the complex dynamics of the human mind and the many factors that influence our behavior. The importance of the ID, ego, and superego. The ID, ego, and superego are all important parts of our personality. The ID helps us to meet our basic needs and to survive. The ego helps us to function in the world and to achieve our goals. The superego helps us to develop a moral conscience and to live a socially acceptable life. A healthy personality is one in which the ID, ego, and superego are in balance. If the ID is too strong, it can lead to impulsive and reckless behavior. If the ego is too weak, it may be difficult to achieve our goals or to resist temptation. If the superego is too strong, it can lead to guilt, anxiety, and shame. How the ID, ego, and superego influence our behavior. The ID, ego, and superego influence our behavior in a variety of ways. For example, the ID may motivate us to eat a delicious cake, even though we know that it is unhealthy. The ego may help us to resist the temptation to eat the cake by reminding us of our fitness goals. The superego may make us feel guilty if we do eat the cake, because we know that we are violating our moral code. The implications of Freud's theory for understanding personality and mental health. Freud's theory of the ID, ego, and superego has a number of implications for understanding personality and mental health. For example, Freud believed that an imbalance between the ID, ego, and superego could lead to a variety of mental disorders, such as anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Freud's theory has also been used to develop new treatments for mental disorders. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a type of therapy that helps people to identify and change their negative thoughts and behaviors. CBT is based on the premise that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interconnected. Conclusion. Freud's theory of the ID, ego, and superego is a complex and influential theory that has helped us to understand the human mind and behavior. While the theory has been criticized for some of its claims, it remains an important part of psychology and continues to be used to develop new treatments for mental disorders.